as Reef loves to call him. His name is Judd Legum, and therefore he writes Popular Information, which is one of the OG Substacks. It's got tens of thousands of paid subscribers. And what he's saying here is you get what you pay for. And my title for this segment is I don't even remember what it was, but it was kind of vague and generic. But what's going on here? A new report from Brown University's Costs of War Project shared exclusively with Popular Information, which is why I brought this article. This is an exclusive. This is a report that nobody else really had seen or reported on. All right. It reveals how decades of enormous military spending have reshaped the federal government and the U.S. economy. Fascinating info coming out of this. Today, more than half of all discretionary spending is spent on defense, quote-unquote defense. Military personnel make up the majority of federal government employees. Let me repeat that. Military personnel make up the majority of federal government employees. And private military contractors are a leading force in the U.S. economy. Meanwhile, investments in infrastructure, healthcare, education, and emergency preparedness have been crowded out. Now, our friend Solomon Grumbine would say we could be doing both and should be. And
man,
I don't really have much of an answer for why not, other than what happens in an economic downturn globally. You can't just keep printing money. But the numbers are startling. There are about 3.5 million people who work for the federal government, including civilians and uniformed military personnel. 72% of all federal workers are defense-related, including DoD civilians.
What about the 10%?
What about the 10%? But DoD, uniformed military personnel, and the Department of Veterans Affairs staff. Meanwhile, the Department of Health and Human Services employs 4% of federal civilian workers. The State Department, tasked with using diplomacy to avert wars, employs 1% versus 72%. I wonder why we are a war hawkish country. Figure 3. Now, this is the breakdown of federal civilian and uniformed personnel for last year, which is also fascinating. You had 38% of active duty personnel at 38%. That was the most. All other federal civilian personnel at 29%. The personnel running the VA at 12%. And the DoD civilians making up another 21%. That's a pretty big pie. The Department of Defense has a budget of $849 billion in the current fiscal year, and more than half is funneled to military contractors. About 30% of this money goes to just 5 firms: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman. That's not spelled right. Grumman. Anyway, billions are awarded without competitive bidding because there's no competitors. In 2020, for example, only 10% of Lockheed Martin's contracts were subject to competition. Now, how many of you have subbed to the Lockheed Martin OnlyFans? How many of you are loyalists for the Raytheon Patreon? I'm quoting Jesse Chet. Despite the massive sums of money involved, quote, we know surprisingly little about how they spend these funds, what kinds of jobs and pay are supported, which subcontractors are paid, and how much. All 5 companies spend in excess of $10 million annually lobbying the federal government. $10 million, 30% of the half of the money. So let's see, 849, let's take 850, half of that is 425. 30% of the 425, that's about $120 billion, $150 billion right there. They spend in excess of $10 million annually lobbying the government to get $150 billion in contracts. Think they're getting return on investment?
Yeah.
Today, military contracts are distributed to every congressional district and nearly every county in the United States. According to the report, this isn't an accident. Why? Because military contractors understand that spreading out contracts means buying and gaining political support. Strategy produces more constituents and more politicians fighting to win or maintain those contracts for the sake of their jobs. Of course. But military spending comes at a cost. Yes, it does. And this is what the cover of this thumbnail is going to look like. Since 2015, the U.S. has added more than $300 billion to its annual defense spending. Thank both Obama and Trump, and now Joe Biden, for even increasing on Trump's budget every year. 860 some odd billion, I believe he's looking for, maybe even 880 something next year. That 300 billion alone, that increase, is equivalent to the annual cost of providing universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, 2 years of free community college for high school graduates, and health insurance for uninsured Americans combined. And here's the breakdown. Now, what you'd have to do is ditch the entire defense contractor money. You've got 318 for 40% emission reduction, 260 billion for an infrastructure at A grade. Right now, I believe we're at a D. 149 billion to extend healthcare coverage. 109 billion gets 2 years of free community college. 46 billion, just 46 billion, gets you universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds a year. And 858 billion is what we spend on defense. Defense. When we're the ones that are destabilizing countries all over the world. Who attacked us exactly? Right. The situation described in the report is likely to worsen following the recent passage of a deal to raise the debt ceiling, which reduces most discretionary spending for 2 years while allowing defense spending to continue apace. Go figure. U.S. taxpayers have gotten what they've paid for, which is an economy that is devoted to the military, both in terms of spending and in terms of jobs. That's the author of the study, Dr. Heidi Peltier, concludes. The following is a transcript of Popular Information's interview with Peltier, edited for length and clarity. So he asks a couple questions. He says that she describes in the report that today, both the federal government and to a certain extent the economy overall is dominated by military spend. When did this dynamic begin? Until recently, it would go up during wartime and down during peacetime. And what we're seeing in recent years is that it keeps going up even when we're not at war. So with the exit from Afghanistan and the winding down of the Iraq War, we really should be seeing military spending going down, and yet we continue to see increased military budgets. So that's something that I think has changed over the last 20 years in the post-9/11 era. Right? So then he asks, many politicians and pundits argue that the U.S. is not spending enough on the military. Really? Not spending enough. They can fuck off. One of the arguments that I see centers around purchasing power. The argument is that we spend more than the next 10 or 11 countries combined on our military, but that distorts reality because it's much cheaper for the Chinese to pay for things. So what would you say to that? Well, she's saying that we spend 3 times as much as China, and we spend 10 times as much as Russia. And if that argument were true, you could look at the numbers of tanks, drones, weapons, and ammo. But there's some ability to make things cheaper in China. The United States still has a lot more tanks and a lot more nuclear weaponry, a lot more ammunition, and a lot more weapon systems of all types. Because we are warmongers. So Judd then asks, another common argument is that we have a dominant position over countries like China now, but they're investing aggressively, so we need to continue to invest aggressively to stay ahead. So she says that we're spending upwards of $850 billion on the military. You could cut that by 10% or even 20%, and we'd still be aggressively investing, especially given that we're not at war. But we're spending some money on Ukraine, but we ourselves are not at war. Yeah, okay. We're spending some money on the Ukraine war. $200 billion this year, or in the last year and a half. Some money. No big deal. He then says, you note in the paper that billions are funneled to defense contractors, but not much is known about how that money is spent. Why is that? Well, some of them are overseas. They pay some of the defense contractors overseas pay subcontractors who then also pay subcontractors. And the chain can go on and sometimes 3 or 4 contractors deep. And in particular, in conflict areas where U.S. contractors are receiving contracts and then hiring local companies or third country companies to perform some of the subcontracts, there's not much oversight or enough. It's very easy to lose track of who's getting the money and how much is getting into whose hands. So half the DOD budget stays within the DOD, half of its budget goes to contractors, and then we quickly lose sight of what happens to the funding and the personnel that makes up that half the military spend. That makes perfect sense to me. He says it's still fairly rare to see prominent elected officials criticize the level of U.S. military spend. Why do you think the arguments you make in this paper are so marginalized? She says, of course, first, Congress people are beholden to the military because nobody wants to be their congressman who cuts funding to their district and is seen as responsible for any potential job loss. This is why they put military bases in every district, because they now want to make you beholden to the military because otherwise you're now costing your district jobs. So then you get both Republicans and Democrats arguing against cutting any military funding or arguing for increasing military funding because they don't want to take any chance on job losses in their own district. And then related to that, it's seen as very unpatriotic to cut military spending. Thank you, corporate media, for propagating that bullshit. Political support for the military is seen as a show of patriotism and supporting of U.S. dominance, and nobody wants to be seen as unpatriotic. Heaven forbid you actually practice diplomacy. I hate it here.
Yep.